What is up, everybody? I'm No Luxgiven here with your afternoon snap, and today I am doing a full breakdown of one of the most powerful and unique cards in Marvel Snap, Professor Charles Xavier. I've already done a breakdown of most of the cards in this deck in previous videos, and tomorrow I'm going to be breaking down Destroyer to finish off the series, but today we're looking at Professor X, which has a lot of different interesting and niche applications, and I'm going to go over most of those today. Now, the main reason that Professor X is in the deck is to combo with Destroyer, so that way you can protect your cards from Destroyer's on reveal ability, and to lock your opponent out of locations, typically paired along with Spider-Man. In this game, we're kind of going to be using Professor X for that first ability to protect me from destroy effects, though it's going to wind up playing out a little bit different. We've got two destruction-based locations with Death's Domain and Altar of Death. Altar of Death, one of the coolest locations in the game, and I'm going to throw Galactus into the Altar of Death this turn. I didn't go for armor in Death's Domain, by the way, because I didn't want to give my opponent any freebies as well, but I will go for Galactus in Altar of Death, and at this point, I'm basically just looking to tie the game. Though, if we can find Professor X, then maybe we can win. So that's part of the idea here as well. Galactus also allows us to blow up my opponent's Daredevil, so now I don't have to worry about that, and as long as my opponent doesn't have their own Professor X here, we should be good, and it looks like they don't. They have Black Widow, which is still kind of annoying. It's going to deny me one card draw, so it's going to be just that much tougher to find my Professor X, but I'm going to Spider-Man my opponent on the penultimate turn, as well as play Daredevil and Widow's Bite to give us a little bit more energy for that final turn, and if we can draw Professor X, we should be in a pretty good spot. Let's see if we do. Also, the cool thing about this one, my opponent's somewhat inclined to stay in this game. I already showed my armor, so I have to play exactly Professor X or some way to change the location or something. Otherwise, my opponent's just thinking this one's a draw. So they're going to stay in it, and luckily we do draw Professor X on the final turn, and we even get to throw Destroyer down alongside it for that sweet 8-cube victory. This is the deck list that I'm going to be using throughout most of today's video, though some of the games will also feature the Kang deck list that I showed off yesterday with Green Goblin and Kang instead of Daredevil and Cosmo. I do want to take a second just to stop down and talk about some things that Professor X can do, and Daredevil, while we're on the subject, that is a great time to bring up Daredevil. Daredevil getting to see what your opponent's plans are on turn 5 was actually part of the reason that I built this deck the way that I did. Thought that was a really powerful interaction that can not only win cubes, but also just scare your opponents away from the game, especially in battle mode, which this deck was originally built for. That's a lot of pressure when you snap on turn 5 to just know what your opponent is going to do, win one of the locations, makes your job a lot easier in terms of winning the game overall. And I'm not going to touch too much on the basics with this video, but again, just to reiterate on those points, Professor X paired with Spider-Man. We actually looked at a decent amount of that in the Spider-Man video a few days ago, so check that one out if you want to see more about what I'm talking about, but that is a really good combo that can just win games, especially when paired with any other location that can lock your opponent out. The other main game plan, like I said, is Professor X plus Destroyer, using Professor X to cheese some location, and then Destroyer gets to come down on the final turn with a whole bunch of power, which is normally enough to win that location as well. And we might look at that tomorrow in the dedicated Destroyer video. But one other cool way to use Professor X that doesn't get talked about too much is actually to play around Arrow as a Galactus deck. Some of the curves for this deck are going to look like a turn 3 Electro into a turn 4 Professor X, and the whole point of that Professor X is to lock one location, the location that your Electro is in, not to protect your Electro, not to win that location, but just so that Galactus can't get pulled to that location from Arrow, or in the case of Magneto, cards can't get pulled out. So those are the main uses for Professor X, but I also wanted to touch on some locations that work really well with him. As I showed off in that first game, any destroy locations can work really well, and also Luke's bar, which I think I showed off the other day, but make sure that your opponent has priority or can't otherwise play to the location. Otherwise, Professor X will flip over first, and then whatever your opponent plays will also get to stay there, and you could lose because of it. But the main concept that I wanted to talk about is purely psychological, and Professor X is really good if you can get into your opponent's head. Obviously, Daredevil is a little bit of a cheat in this regard, but there's also some ways to tell what your opponent might do based off the available locations that game. I think the ones that come up the most often here are Kiln and Asgard. You will have to ramp into your Professor on turn 4 to make these matter, but these are locations that your opponents are very likely to play to, so you can play elsewhere and potentially steal a location with the Professor for very little investment. Any location can be applicable. If you think that your opponent is more likely to play to one place or the other, then keep that in mind when you drop your Professor X. Again, this is an Electro example, but oftentimes Storm plays very much like the Kiln. You can't play cards there after turn 4, and in this scenario, I think that my opponent is very likely to drop a card into the flooded location this turn before it goes away. So I'm just going to use Professor X in the Tinkerer's Workshop so I can win that location with just the Professor, and then I should be able to battle in Sokovia. I've got Destroyer, I've got Atuma, we're already set up there with armor. That's going to make it pretty tough for my opponent to battle, especially because they just aren't going to be able to play cards to one of the 3 locations this game. Actually, 2 of the 3 locations. Everything for the rest of this game has to get played into Sokovia, and that doesn't really suit what my opponent's deck is likely trying to do, as it is a Khazar deck, which is looking to flood the field with a bunch of cheap stuff. So just being able to drop this huge Destroy and monster here is going to be more than my opponent can take. One other card that you can play around with Professor X is Galactus itself, and you'll definitely want to watch out for this if you are playing this deck, that you don't get Professor X'd on your Galactus turn. On this one, I've got the Daredevil sight, and we can see that my opponent is going to go for Galactus, so I'm going to Professor X and snap, and this is a 1 game at this point. We are going to destroy all other cards, and there is actually a nice mechanical thing to note here as well, that Professor X will not let Wolverine into this location, which is going to take away my opponent's only shot at winning here. But we're going to see the Wolverine flip over into Hell's Kitchen briefly, and then just totally get destroyed and be unable to return. So that's some nice, like, kind of mechanic things that I was talking about that it's nice to know if you want to know how to play the Professor. Here's another mechanic that is important to know, Titania. Now, we obviously don't play Titania in this deck, but that's how Titania works. If your opponent plays it, you can steal it. So you still need to know how cards like this can work, and anything that changes lanes, sides of the board rather, Professor X is going to be able to stop. So if we play Professor X here, assuming my opponent doesn't play anything into Mojo World this turn, which is certainly possible, but if that doesn't happen, then we'll be able to win in Mojo World with the Professor X. Let's take a look at that, see what my opponent does here, just so I can show that off. And my opponent goes for a She-Hulk in the center, and then we're going to play Professor X and we'll be able to win Mojo World. So now we just have to win one of these other 2 locations, and we'll probably just battle for Danger Room. This turn I can throw Armor plus Cosmo into the Danger Room, so I don't have to worry about anything exploding, and then I can finish that off on turn 6 with a Destroyer, and that should be big enough to take it. And indeed it is. And this is a pretty weird mechanic to know about, but it can be a little bit more important, especially in the Kang version of the deck, which also plays Green Goblin, to at least understand these mechanics. And for the most part, like I said, it's not really going to come up, though with Peak, you do have to do some cheeky things to hang on to your Green Goblins. Once your Goblins are peaked, then they actually add power to the board and they're free, so they just become totally different cards. There's a few ways to still make use of them. Either if your opponent's location is full, then they won't really be able to make use of the stats and you'll get to hang on to them, or you can hang on to the stats with Professor X. So that's what we're going to do in this one. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit here. I'm just going to throw down an Electro, basically to kind of bide my time and see if my opponent was willing to commit any additional cards to the board. I don't really exactly know what they're playing, but then I'm going to wind up throwing down Galactus here on turn 4. We've got the flipped Galactus that I will run out. So I decide to snap. We'll see if my opponent is able to disrupt this at all. With only 4 energy this turn, it's not super likely, like they can't arrow, we're still ahead of that. So that was part of the reason I snapped here. I felt like we were pretty likely to get away with this. They just wind up dropping a She-Hulk into the ruins, and then we're going to blow up everything that they have done so far this game with a Galactus. And I'm going to make turn 5 the final turn of the game. I'm going to play Professor X and Green Goblin, and it is important that you play them in that order. If you play them in the other order, then you'll just give your opponent a Green Goblin, but in this case, Professor X will lock the location down, which does include allowing cards to pass between players. And here we can see my opponent has the arrow, but a little too late. Here's another mechanic you'll want to be aware of. Professor X can stop Lockjaw. So these cards aren't going to go away, they're just going to stay there, and my opponent played a bunch of rocks. This game previously had Subterranea, Reality Stone, took it off the screen there, but my opponent had a bunch of rocks that they were trying to get rid of, and Professor said, no, you're going to hang on to those. This is a pretty similar example, but Quantum Tunnel winds up working out about the same as Lockjaw. No cards can come in or out once you find that professor in the location. And in this one, I played 2 cards here this turn. The first one turns into Professor X, and then the second one just gets locked into the location and won't go through the tunnel. But the other cool thing that I wanted to talk about with this one, and it's a nice transition into the next topic, is movement and Professor X. My opponent moves in a Vision, and now Vision is stuck in this location. This works out really well for us in this game. We saw me lock onto a Captain Marvel the other day, not allow that to leave, which allowed us to win, and I also used this same trick in the Marvel Snap Clash Invitational to win, using Professor X to lock, same card, a Vision into the location. I was actually playing against, probably the same deck list here, and that means that my opponent isn't going to be able to salvage the Vision, which is typically one of the good uses for movement cards. You can, move them where you need them to. But now we've locked down the Vision, and with Destroyer, we should be able to take it in the hub. My opponent puts up a good fight, but Wasp is not quite going to be enough, and we can see that Vision would have been. Here's another one with Professor X locking down some movement abilities. We're locking down a bunch of stuff this game. I'm going to go for Cosmo into Camartage. We're back looking at the Cosmo and Daredevil build of the deck. And then because of Superflow, we are going to have an extra energy, and my opponent also waves. But either way, we'll be able to play the Professor this turn. Now, my opponent could actually be playing a Galactus deck. So that's a huge reason to Professor X into the Superflow. But the other cool reason to Professor X into the Superflow, if my opponent isn't playing a Galactus deck and instead is just playing a ramp deck, which that seems like that's the case, is people are also pretty unlikely to play into Superflow. I talked about looking for locations like Kiln and Asgard, where people are likely to play to those locations, and then you play to other ones. Well, Superflow is a great example of a location that people try to not play to, so that way they can keep getting that bonus energy, and we get to take nice advantage of that by dropping Professor X there to win it. I'm going to follow this one up with Atuma to just try to win in Camartage. We're going to look for Atuma, and we will look for Destroyer in the next few turns, and we draw it, so it seems like we are in a pretty good spot. I'm just going to finish off turn 5 with a Wolverine, and oh, that's right, I can't play Wolverine and the Wave. I guess I just go for Wolverine. I think that with my opponent playing Sandman, there's not really too much more that they could have got done this game. Camartage, or Cosmo rather, locking them out of Camartage, putting in some nice work here, and then we're only down by 1, so my opponent, in order to win this one, I don't even know if there's anything that they could have at this point. I'm trying to think if, like we beat Arrow. Actually, yeah, we still beat Arrow. It's close, but I think that we would beat it. It would be a 50-50 if Wolverine could, where Wolverine winds up resummoning, but 50-50 that we beat Arrow here. Though what we actually beat, I think, is also kind of interesting. My opponent doesn't actually have a great play here, and I do wind up snapping, feeling mostly pretty confident. I'll snap on a 50-50. I think that that's always good to do. But what my opponent actually has here is the other thing that I was trying to talk about, which is Jubilee, but Jubilee brings out Captain Marvel. And we looked at a video the other day. You might not be able to see it. There we go. It finally loads in. Captain Marvel can't move out of a Professor X location, but this was just confirmation that I wanted to show that Captain Marvel also can't move into a Professor X location. And Professor X, just now thinking about it off the top of my head, can also stop M'Baku, which is not a card that comes up too often, but I figured I'd at least mention it. So there's a lot of cool interactions with Professor X and movement, but I think that my favorite one is Strange Academy. We're going to look at two games though. I've got even more that I could have showcased. These are my two favorite games with Professor X and Strange Academy. So in this one, we also have Daredevil Sight. We know what my opponent is going to be doing this game. They're playing a Lady Sif into the Strange Academy, and I'm just going to Professor X into Mojo World and snap. And the reason that I snap here is because at the end of this turn, all of my opponent's cards are going to move into Vormir, and they're going to be locked out of Mojo World. And then there's only one turn left in the game, and we probably get to play a bigger card than my opponent. Destroyer is just a really big card. Talked about this at the beginning. Part of the reason it's such a good combo with Professor X is Professor just needs to win one location, and then Destroyer does a great job at soloing the last location. And that's exactly what we're going to see here, though this one is actually really close. Maybe I should have saved this one as the last game of the video, but I think that the next game I'm going to showcase is even better. But this one's really cool. We're playing Destroyer. I might have talked over it, but Lady Sif discarded Magneto, so my opponent here, and I kind of was aware of this, they can Ghost Rider, pick up their Magneto, and will actually tie with them in the Strange Academy. So they did do a really good job putting out a bunch of power on the final turn. However, because we won in Mojo World, we will be able to win on differential. And here is the last game of the video to wrap things up. We've got Death's Domain, which is a pretty good location with Professor X, also Hala, so a lot of options. We'll get to lead this game off with Wolverine into Death's Domain, and I snap because we just have so many different tools at our disposal here. Next turn, we get to play Electro into Death's Domain, and then we could even Galactus in Death's Domain later on. So a lot of different potential things that we can do. Wolverine's going to show up over in Hala, which is nice. We actually just didn't want it to be in Death's Domain, so that way we didn't have to worry about we can play Galactus there later. That's what I was getting to. So on turn 3, we play Electro in Death's Domain, get that benefit and get Electro out of there. My opponent just plays Mr. Negative into Hala. They could have played that into Death's Domain as well, but Hala is basically just the same. From here, there's a lot of different ideas that I'm thinking about. I kind of want to use Professor to do the same play with Strange Academy and lock the locations that my opponent's things are allowed to move to. It also seems like a pretty straightforward win in Hala, so I'm definitely interested in that, but I think I should go for the Hobgoblin first and get that out of the way this turn. We can always Professor X in Death's Domain to win that location as well, so that is another really good option. Though what my opponent has here is a Jubilee, so that is actually going to be a way that they can play into Death's Domain, and now Professor X would tie that location. So a little bit tricky, that makes me not really want to play the Professor there, but is actually going to open up a completely different play line on the 5th turn of the game. And that's basically the same Strange Academy play that we just looked at. Now I can play Professor X into Hala, and my opponent is actually very tempted to put as many cards into Strange Academy as they can this turn, because they won't really be able to play to Death's Domain after this turn. So they don't really care if they fill Death's Domain, but obviously that's going to allow us to easily win in that location with a turn 6 Galactus. So this one I definitely thought was silly. We're using a lot of different mechanics. I was even double thinking this if I really wanted to go through it, but I think that it will work out nicely for us depending on what my opponent does here. So my opponent winds up playing a few more cards to Death's Domain, an Absorbing Man to copy Jubilee, so that's going to take one more card out of their deck, which is Wong, and then the final card that they will reveal this turn, which is going to get the Wong bonus. Will it matter? Psylocke. So my opponent is going to have 2 extra energy this turn. Crazy play from my opponent, by the way. But now the trick is that when Hobgoblin moves over into that location, they are full in that location, and we have priority on the final turn, so it doesn't really matter that my opponent has a bunch of extra energy, that all of their cards are flipped. We're going to play Galactus. Galactus is going to destroy itself, and this is the other important thing to know. Professor X locks down the location. This is the last mechanic on the last video of this, or last game of this video, but Professor X locks down the location, but Galactus destroys the location. So once the location is gone, it's no longer locked down, and that's important because it means Wolverine can move out of a Professor X location to join Galactus. So that is going to be enough to allow us to get the win here in Death's Domain. Despite the fact that our Galactus will be destroyed, our Wolverine is free to grab the win. That's going to be it for me today, guys. Thank you very much for watching. I'm No Lux Given. Peace.